Do you believe evil can live in a location the way rot lives in wood? Quiet, patient, spreading in the dark where no one wants to look too closely? Do you believe a place can become a trap, not because it's haunted in the way people like to romanticize, but because something there has learned the shape of fear and uses it like a tool? Welcome to Whispers After Dark, where shadows speak and the night listens. If you want to follow this story all the way to its end, or whatever passes for an end when a place like Devil's Island is involved, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. Tonight's story is The Devil's Lighthouse, Part 2 of a 4-part series. My name is Tyler Reed. I'm a Coast Guard officer, and I was assigned the call 2 months after Daniel Mercer crawled out of the sea half frozen and half out of his mind, insisting that demons lived inside the stone walls of an abandoned lighthouse. At the time, his report was treated like a problem to be filed, not a warning to be understood. I didn't take it seriously either. Not until the teenagers went missing. The call came in just after dawn, the kind of early-hour ring that makes you sit up before you're fully awake. 4 boys, last known location, Devil's Island. The parents' statements were a familiar blend of panic and disbelief. Kids do stupid things, but not like this, not vanish without a trace. A deputy added the detail that made my stomach tighten. There was a video. The boys had posted a clip online the night before, laughing as they pointed at the dark shape of the lighthouse and promised they'd spend the night inside. The last message had been cocky, playful, the kind of bravado you expect from teenagers who don't believe the world can hurt them the way it hurts adults. As soon as the call ended, I was moving through the station with that cold, focused urgency that comes with search and rescue. SAR. We say it like a shortcut, but it's never short. It's hours of planning and minutes of action, and the difference between those two is where people die. I pulled weather, tides, and daylight windows. I requested a small retrieval team instead of a full-scale operation because the reports made it sound like reckless trespassing more than a mass casualty event. I filed the request for a boat crew, a medic, and a shoreline sweep team, and then I went down to the records office to pull everything we had on Devil's Island. That was when I found Daniel Mercer's account. Not in a central incident file where it should have been, not flagged under restricted areas, not cross-referenced with the lighthouse. It was buried in routine paperwork like someone had shoved it out of sight and hoped time would do the rest. A statement, a transmission log, a recommendation stamped and tucked away with the kind of administrative indifference that kills people later. The report read like a man trying to stay sane by clinging to details. The malfunctions, the coordinates repeating over the radio, the claw sounds circling the tower, men taken through stone. It was the kind of narrative you'd usually dismiss as trauma talk, until you noticed the parts that matched physical evidence. The damaged boat, the deep carvings on driftwood, the strange arrangement along the shoreline. The fact that a seasoned rescue crew had recovered him offshore shaking and silent, with mortar dust and dried blood under his fingernails, as if he'd been clawing at walls. I stared at the final line long enough that the paper felt warm under my fingers. On Devil's Island, night always comes too soon, and when it does, the demons come fast. I should have called my supervisor. I should have escalated. I should have questioned why this report wasn't sitting on top of the island's file like a bright red warning label. Instead, I did the only thing that felt remotely sensible in that moment. I called Daniel. It took 2 tries before he answered. When he finally did, his voice was rough and quiet, like he was speaking from the bottom of a locked room. "Daniel Mercer," I said, keeping my tone official, steady, the way we're trained to sound when someone's panicking. "This is Coast Guard Lieutenant Tyler Reed. I'm calling about Devil's Island. 4 boys are missing." There was a pause on the other end that stretched too long. I could hear his breathing, slow, controlled, like he was counting it. "You're going," he said. Not a question. "Yes," I replied. Another pause, and then the words came out low, clipped, like he didn't want to say them and didn't know how not to. "Don't stay after sunset." I didn't answer right away. SAR planning doesn't always get to decide what the ocean and weather will allow. Choosing my words carefully, I replied, "Any advice that helps us bring them back alive is relevant." He let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more like a bitter exhale. "Alive," he repeated, like the word didn't fit anymore. It would take a miracle, or a prayer, to find them alive. What's on that island is evil, and it doesn't give things back once the sun goes down. His voice dropped even lower, rough around the edges. "If they stayed overnight, you won't find them alive." I felt a chill go through me that had nothing to do with the morning air. I'd read his report, and on paper it sounded like something you'd dismiss as shock, grief, and sleeplessness stitched into a horror story. Hearing his voice now, steady, worn down to the bone, made it harder to pretend. "Daniel," I said, softer, "what are we dealing with out there? Any help you can give me is appreciated." His answer came after a long silence, and when it did, it was barely more than a whisper. "A place far more evil than you can imagine. The Devil's Lighthouse is a place of demons. It is the mouth of hell." The line went dead. The call ended with no clean conclusion, just his words hang in the air like a curse I couldn't unhear. Demons, mouth of hell, and the cold realization that I was walking towards something I'd never encountered before. An hour later, I was standing on the deck with a 4-man search and rescue crew as we cut across the gray water toward Devil's Island, and for the first time in my career I found myself wondering, not what we'd find out there, but whether we'd all make it back alive. The sea was calm, calm enough that it made the island look harmless. Devil's Island rose ahead of us like a dark ridge against gray water, scrub forest clinging to rock, and above it, the lighthouse stood on the north ridge like a broken tooth, its silhouette sharp against the low clouds. The calm water should have been a comfort. Instead, it felt like the ocean was holding still on purpose, like it didn't want to disturb whatever lived there. We approached the rocky shore on the southern side and idled in, scanning for any sign of the boys. The first thing I saw made my stomach drop, because I recognized it from Daniel's report before I could even read the name painted on the side. The Lady of the Sea sat in the shallows at a wrong angle, half flooded, rocking gently like it was exhausted. Even from a distance you could see what had been done to her. An ugly, ragged tear along the hull with the fiberglass peeled back, edges clawed and splintered as if something had punched through and then widened the wound on purpose. Nearby, closer to the rocks, a smaller boat lay busted open too, its hull bashed and cracked like it had been thrown against stone and left to bleed out into the tide. I stared at those torn openings and heard Daniel's voice in my head, tight and hoarse, "The demons come after dark." We landed with the kind of practiced efficiency you get when people have done too many shoreline recoveries to waste motion. The tide was low enough to expose slick rock shelves, and the air smelled like salt and wet kelp, with something faintly metallic underneath, like old pennies left in a puddle. The wind here didn't behave the way it did out at sea. Out on open water, wind has room to move. It comes clean, it pushes clean. On Devil's Island, it slid around the rock as if the island had edges that bent it. It made the scrub brush whisper and then go still, whisper and then go still, like the island couldn't decide whether to speak or listen. We climbed up from the shallows, boots grinding on gravel, and I felt that familiar SAR focus settle in. Scan, mark, move, while a colder part of me kept looking north toward the ridge where the lighthouse stood, dark against the low clouds, like a tooth in a rotten mouth. We ran a quick visual sweep before splitting into pairs. 2 of us kept the shoreline, 2 pushed inland along the scrub line, It wasn't far before we found signs that kids had been here. Not subtle, not hidden. An empty energy drink can wedge between rocks, a torn candy wrapper caught on a thorny branch, a path of scuffed ground where shoes had slid and corrected, the kind of careless trail teenagers leave when they're more excited than careful. The tracks angled toward a small flat area where the brush opened, and then we saw the campsite. A cold ring of stones where a fire had burned, food wrappers fluttering in the scrub, a torn backpack, a sleeping bag half dragged, like someone had tried to yank it free and then abandoned it mid-pull. The scene didn't look like a planned departure. It looked like panic, like 4 kids had started the night laughing and ended it running. It looked like a scene interrupted, not abandoned, a ring of stones with blackened ash in the center. Half-burnt wood scattered like someone had kicked the fire apart in a hurry. 2 sleeping bags still rolled out, one twisted as if it had been grabbed and yanked. A backpack lay on its side with contents spilled. Flashlight, hoodie, a phone charger. Things you don't leave behind if you're leaving by choice. The wind lifted the corner of a tarp and slapped it softly against rock, a steady little sound that felt too ordinary for how wrong everything else was. I stood there for a moment and let the silence press against my ears, thinking about Daniel's words, thinking about how quickly a night can turn from daring to terror. Then I saw the camera. It was sitting near the edge of the fire ring, angled toward the open space as if someone had set it down to record their proof. The red light was still blinking, still recording, like it had been left behind mid-moment and never told to stop. I crouched and lifted it carefully, feeling the grit on its casing, the faint warmth of a battery that hadn't fully died yet. The screen showed a jittery view of firelight and dark scrub beyond, and when I hit playback, the first seconds were exactly what you'd expect. Laughter, bravado, boys leaning too close to the lens and calling the place Devil's Island, like they were joking about a haunted house. The lighthouse loomed in the far distance, a black shape against a darker sky, and I watched one of them point at it and grin like fear was a game. Then the sound changed. At first it was small, barely there, a thin scratching under the wind, like something dragging a nail along stone. One of the boys paused mid-sentence and asked, "Did you hear that?" Another laughed and told him to stop being dramatic. The camera swung toward the dark, and the firelight reached only so far, painting the scrub in trembling orange. Something moved just beyond the light, low to the ground. Not a clean animal movement, not the quick dart of a raccoon or the cautious creep of a fox. This was slower, intentional. It slid forward and stopped, like it understood exactly where the light ended and didn't want to cross it yet. The boy holding the camera swallowed hard. You could hear it. The laughter drained out of the moment like water running out of a cracked cup. Flashlights clicked on, beams cutting through the dark in frantic arcs, and for a second one beam landed on a shape crouched at the edge of the firelight. My stomach tightened. Even through the pixel grain it was wrong. Too long in the limbs, too low in posture, its head angled at a sharp tilt as if it were measuring them. The eyes caught the beam and flared pale, reflective, and the mouth opened slightly in something that looked too much like a grin. I swear it looked like it had horns. One of the boys whispered, "What is that?" And then it was like all hell broke loose. The camera jolted as the boys scrambled, the image whipping between firelight and darkness, catching brief flashes of movement, low shapes slipping in the scrub, a quick skitter across rock, the faint wet clicking chatter that made the hair on my arms lift. The boys started running, breath tearing in their throats, shoes slapping stone, and the lighthouse appeared again in the distance, the only landmark big enough to promise shelter. The last clear thing the camera captured before it swung wild was the ridge line and that dark tower of the lighthouse waiting there like it had been expecting them. My thumb hit the stop button, hard enough to make the device click in my grip. For a moment I just sat there, crouched by the dead fire ring, staring at the black screen, while the island's wind slid through scrub behind me. My team waited, silent, watching my face for answers I didn't want to give. Daniel had already told me what it was. Until that moment, I don't think I really believed him. "We're going to the lighthouse," I said, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt. We left the campsite as it was, an interrupted circle of ash and panic, and started the climb north. The ground rose in uneven shelves, slick in places where mist had settled. The wind strengthened as we gained elevation, carrying the sea's salt and the sharp scent of wet stone. The farther we went, the quieter the island seemed, as if the scrub and rocks were swallowing sound. I kept expecting to hear gulls, to see something living move through the brush, to find some ordinary proof that this was just a dumb, tragic accident. Instead, my eyes kept catching the deep gashes split into the black rock under our boots, jagged cuts and narrow fissures that looked like the island had been clawed open. Salt mist drifted through them and vanished, swallowed by shadow. And I couldn't shake the thought that if any place on earth could look like the mouth to hell, this was it. As the lighthouse grew larger above us, black windows staring out over the cliff, I couldn't stop thinking about one detail Daniel wrote in his report, the way the equipment died when it got too close. We reached the base just as the light started to thin again, the sun slipping behind the low storm ceiling and turning the world the color of old metal. Up close, the lighthouse didn't look like a landmark. It looked like a wound. The stone was stained dark with salt and time. The mortar between the blocks cracked and soft in places, as if the whole structure had been slowly breathing in damp air for decades. The door faced the sea, a heavy slab of warped wood set into a stone frame, and the first thing I noticed was the way it hung wrong, tilted, as if it had been pulled and twisted. The second thing I noticed was the gouging around the latch, deep claw marks scored into the wood and into the stone itself. Not shallow scratches, but furrows cut with force. Then I saw the door wasn't simply open. It had been torn inward. Splintered boards jutted into the entryway like broken ribs, and the stone frame bore fresh fractures that hadn't been there in old photographs. The damage didn't look like weather. It looked like violence from the inside, like something trapped behind it had decided it was done waiting. We stepped in with flashlights up, voices low, the way you do when you've walked into a place you know you shouldn't disturb. The air inside hit like a damp cloth, salt, rot, old lantern oil, and something coppery that didn't belong. My beam swept across the floor and caught dark spots on the stone near the threshold. At first I thought it was just wetness tracked in from the shoreline, but as I moved closer, the light picked up the color. Thick, dark, dried in uneven splashes, blood. It was smeared along the lower wall too, not in one clean streak, but in blotches that looked as if someone had pressed a bleeding hand there and then slid downward. The strangest part wasn't the presence of blood. It was the way it seemed to seep into the mortar itself, sinking into the pale cracks between stones as if the lighthouse was absorbing it. I crouched and ran the edge of a gloved finger near one stain. The surface was tacky, not fully dry. The smell was sharp, metallic, and immediate, then stronger as a heady stench of death filled the air. "Dear God," someone muttered, gagging behind me. We didn't say the boys' names out loud, but the silence carried them. We pushed deeper into the ground level, sweeping corners, checking the stairwell, calling out in controlled voices that echoed back thin and wrong. No response. Just the hush of wind working through unseen gaps and the soft, constant drip of water somewhere inside the stone. My flashlight caught more stains farther in, handprints this time, smeared and frantic, pressed against the wall at shoulder height. You could see the drag marks where fingers had slid, the way someone had tried to push away from the stone and failed. Near the base of the spiral staircase, we found the first belonging, a sneaker. Popular brand, one lace snapped and the other still tied. The canvas was soaked dark along the heel and toe, and when I lifted it, the inside was sticky with dried blood. The sight of it was worse than any gore, because it meant at least one of them had been close enough to run, close enough to leave something behind, close enough to think there might be a way out. A little farther along the wall, half under a collapsed bit of old furniture, we found a pair of glasses with one lens cracked. They were the kind of cheap frames kids wear now, thin, modern, and there was a smear of blood across the lens like someone had tried to wipe them clean with shaking hands. On the floor near the wall was a watch, its band torn, the face still lit faintly. Signs of them. Proof they'd made it inside. Proof they'd been alive in here, at least for a moment. Then we found the handprints that made my stomach go hollow. They were low to the ground near the entry corridor, smeared along the stone like someone had fallen and tried to crawl. The prints weren't neat. They were desperate, palms pressed hard, fingers splayed wide, dragging through grit and dust. And the drag marks didn't lead toward the door. They led away from it, toward the wall. At first I thought it was just the way the blood had smeared as someone rolled or was pulled sideways. But when I followed the marks with my light, the pattern was unmistakable. The bloody streaks narrowed as they approached the stone, as if the hands had been lifted, pulled, leaving long, thin trails where fingertips had scraped along the stone floor. The last marks were gouged into the mortar itself, little crescents and scratches where nails had dug in. And then the blood stopped. The stone there looked solid, unbroken, no doorway, no gap, no missing block, just old mortar and damp rock. But the blood at that final point wasn't smeared across the surface the way the rest was. It had sunk into the cracks, darkening the seams as if the lighthouse had taken it in. One of my crew stepped closer and whispered, "How?" I looked at him and shook my head. I didn't answer, because I couldn't. My mouth had gone dry. I reached for my water bottle and removed the cap with shaking hands. My mind flashed back to Daniel's words and the way he'd described men being dragged through stone like it was nothing. Standing there, staring at those last clawed streaks, I understood something in a way I hadn't on paper. The boys had made it to the lighthouse. They just never made it out. Not alive. The moment we stepped back outside, the wind hit us like a shove. The air had thickened while we were inside, heavy, damp, charged, and the sky over the island had darkened into a low, bruised ceiling of storm clouds that moved in layers, sliding over one another as if something underneath them was pushing. The lighthouse stood behind us with its black windows staring out over the cliff, and for the first time since we landed, I felt the urgency shift from searching to surviving. We didn't find the boys. We found what was left behind, and whatever had done it had left marks on the walls like a message. "Back to the boat," I yelled over the wind, and there was no debate in my crew's eyes. We moved fast, keeping close, boots slipping on wet rock as we started down the slope toward the shoreline. The wind made the scrub thrash and hiss. I kept looking over my shoulder at the lighthouse as it shrank behind us, half expecting to see movement along the stone, something low and dark clinging to the outside like a living shadow. The island didn't give us that mercy. It didn't show itself plainly. It let the weather do the work. Halfway down, the first drops hit, cold and hard, followed by a sudden gust that tore at our jackets and threw salt spray inland. The sea, calm an hour ago, had started to chop, the surface darkening as wind raked it into sharp little ridges. The boats down in the shallows bobbed and knocked against rock, and our dock, if you could call it that, was nothing more than a rough plank platform and slick stone edges that now looked like they'd been greased with rain. We reached the shoreline breathing hard, fingers numb, eyes stinging from wind-driven mist. The Lady of the Sea rolled in the shallows, still wounded, still useless. Our rescue craft sat just off the rocks, tether lines straining and snapping taut with each swell. One of my crew lunged for the line and got it around his wrist, fighting to pull us close enough to board without being smashed against the stone. We were boarding the boat when we heard the sounds. It wasn't the wind or the crash of the waves against the rocks, but something else, soft, quick, skittering, moving along the rocks to our right, low and fast, half hidden by the spray. I swung my light instinctively, beam cutting across wet stone, and caught a shape for less than a second. Slick dark skin, a long limb folded tight beneath it, then a flash of pale eyes before it dropped out of sight behind a boulder. I shouted for the crew to move. The first man clambered onto the boat as it rose and fell dangerously with waves crashed around us. The storm clouds swallowed the last of the daylight. It wasn't night yet, but it felt like the island was dragging the sun down early. The dock was slick, the planks shining wet, and the gap between stone and boat widened and narrowed with each wave. We had to time our steps, jump when the boat rose, brace when it dropped. One by one, my crew made it onto the boat, hands grabbing the rail, boots scraping, trying to grip the deck as it rolled violently. The last of the crew to climb on the boat, Carter, was behind me by 3 steps, moving quick, head down against the wind. I heard him curse as his boots slipped on the wet plank. I turned to grab his arm and saw his face in the gray light, eyes wide, mouth open to shout something I never heard. Because the sound that came instead was a sharp, wet click too close. Something burst up from the rocks beside the dock, fast as a spring released. A long, dark limb hooked around Carter's leg. Another arm, thin, too strong, wrapped his waist. He didn't even have time to scream properly. One short sound tore out of him, and then his body jerked sideways, dragged off the dock as if the island itself had reached up and claimed him. He hit the rocks once, hard, then vanished into the spray and shadow below, pulled down into a gap between boulders that should have been too small for a man. The water closed over the spot in white foam. For a heartbeat, none of us moved. My grip locked on the railing so tight my fingers ached. The wind roared. The waves slapped the dock. And somewhere beneath it all, faint as a thought, I heard that low clicking chatter, like teeth talking in the dark. I bellowed the orders to get the engine started and scanned the surf for Carter. I could hear the engine whining, and felt relief when suddenly the engine caught and roared to life. The boat lurched, pulling free of the shoreline's grasp, and as the distance widened between us and Devil's Island, I kept my eyes on the rocks where Carter had disappeared, waiting for him to surface, waiting for anything that could prove I hadn't just watched a man get stolen by shadow. Nothing surfaced. Only spray. Only dark water. And the lighthouse on the ridge above us, shrinking into the storm like it had never been there at all. The lighthouse on the ridge above us shrank into the storm, a dark, jagged line against darker cloud. Then lightning split the sky, and for a fraction of a second the entire island turned stark and white. Every rock edge sharpened, every wet surface gleaming like it had been varnished. In that flash I saw movement on the lighthouse walls. Not birds, not debris. Shadows clinging where there should have been nothing, crawling upward in broken, unnatural shapes. Too low to be people, too many limbs, too deliberate. The light vanished and the tower went black again, but the image stayed burned into my eyes like a stain you can't wash out. As we pulled away, I kept scanning the cliffs, and the island kept answering in lightning. Every time the sky flashed, I caught glimpses of them along the rocky shelves near the waterline, low shapes hugging stone, sliding in and out of narrow cuts in the terrain, like the island had openings it didn't show in daylight. The demon creatures didn't rush the surf. They didn't leap into the sea. They just moved when the light allowed it, and held still when it didn't, like they understood the storm was doing half their work. The wind drove rain sideways, and Devil's Island blurred into mist and black rock, but the sense of being watched didn't blur at all. It sharpened. The sea that had looked manageable on approach had turned mean with the storm front. Visibility fell in waves, clear for a minute, then swallowed again, until the world was nothing but gray water under a bruised sky. I'd been trained to read conditions and make the call that keeps people alive, and the truth was brutal. Turning back to land in that chop would risk smashing the hull against rock, and pushing blind into open water without a safe line would risk losing the boat entirely. So I did the one thing I hated doing. I brought us into the lee of the island, close enough for the landmass to break the worst of the swell, far enough off the rocks to keep us from being dragged in, and we held position until the storm passed. Night came down early, dragged in by those low storm clouds, and Devil's Island disappeared except when lightning stitched it back into existence. The cliffs rose like black teeth. The lighthouse sat somewhere above us, unseen but present, the way you can feel a stare on the back of your neck even when you refuse to turn around. The rain eased into mist, and in the pauses between gusts the silence underneath the weather felt too clean, like something had stopped breathing to listen. That's when we heard it along the rocks. Not surf, not loose stone. A soft skittering of claws traveling along the shoreline. We swept the floodlight over the shelves and caught only slick boulders and white spray. Then lightning flashed again, and the cliffs snapped into sharp relief, and there they were, two shapes crouched on a low shelf near the waterline, limbs folded tight, heads angled in that wrong, jerking way as if they were measuring distance. Their eyes flared pale in the flash, bright as wet glass, and one of them shifted just enough for the curve of horns to cut a clean, impossible silhouette against the storm. The light died. The shapes vanished. The sound stayed. One of the remaining crewmen, Hawkins, stood near the stern with his shoulders hunched against the wind. He hadn't spoken much since the dock, since Carter had been dragged off without even a full scream. None of us had. We kept our voices low, not out of professionalism, but out of instinct, like volume might invite attention. Hawkins said he needed to check the tether line, make sure we weren't drifting closer to the rocks. It was the kind of small, practical task you cling to when your mind is trying to climb out of itself. He leaned over the rail, one hand gripping metal, the other reaching down. The water below him went unnaturally still for a beat, then surged upward. It wasn't a wave. It was a pull, sharp, sudden, deliberate. Hawkins's body jerked sideways as if something had hooked him under the ribs. His grip scraped along the rail, leaving a squeal of skin on metal, and then he went over, vanishing into black water with a splash that sounded too small for a man. I lunged, grabbing for him and catching nothing but wet air, shouting his name into wind that didn't care. Lightning hit again and turned the sea into broken glass for a heartbeat. I saw the churn where he'd gone under, white foam boiling, then smoothing back into dark. Something moved beneath the surface, low and fast, and the clicking chatter rose, faint but close, like teeth speaking just under the waterline. Suddenly a hand broke the surface. It slapped the side of the boat hard, fingers splayed wide, pale under the floodlight, blood streaking the knuckles. Hawkins's other hand followed, clawing for the rail, like he was trying to pull himself out of a mouth. His face surged up behind his hands, water streaming off him, eyes wide and rolling with panic. Something yanked him from below, and his grip slipped, leaving a smear of blood across the metal. I locked onto his wrist and pulled. For a few seconds it was pure force, me hauling, whatever had him hauling back. Hawkins's body rose in stuttering jerks, like the thing beneath the surface kept trying to reclaim him. He screamed then, one raw broken sound, and I threw my weight backward and dragged his chest over the rail. His legs still dangled in the black water, kicking, and I felt a heavy thump against the hull from below, hard enough to rattle the deck. Hawkins jerked once more as if hands had grabbed his ankles, and in the lightning's afterglow I saw a shape twist under the surface, dark limbs reaching out the water, and a horned shadow cutting through the water like a blade. I pulled until something gave. Hawkins spilled onto the deck in a heap, coughing up seawater, shaking so hard his teeth clacked. His pant leg was shredded, and long parallel gouges ran down his calf, bleeding bright even in the dim light. He grabbed my sleeve with trembling fingers and rasped something I couldn't make out, half warning, half prayer, before retching again and curling around the pain. We didn't stay after that. I cut the tether line and pushed us away from the island, engine whining as it caught and drove us forward through the surging waves. The shoreline fell back into storm and mist behind us. Lightning flashed, and I saw movement again along the shelves, low figures clinging where surf couldn't reach, watching us leave. Above the surf and storm, long, thin, screeching wails rose. Dawn came dirty and gray, the storm thinned into ragged cloud, and the sea settled enough to navigate. Hawkins lay under a blanket, eyes opening and closing, shivering in violent waves. When we reached safe waters, I called in medical support and kept my voice steady, using the words that fit forms and radio channels. Hypothermia, lacerations, man overboard, recovered. I didn't say demons. I didn't say what reached up from the dark water to take him. Back at the station, Hawkins was taken straight to medical, and I was left with the debrief, the reports, and the camera we'd recovered from the campsite. Hours later, alone in a room that felt too bright, I played the footage again, this time all the way through, because now I needed it. Not just for me, for the people who would try to bury this the way Daniel's account had been buried. I watched the boys run for the lighthouse, breath ragged, flashlights bouncing wild as they scrambled up the slope. I heard their voices crack into pleading and swearing and panicked prayers. The camera dropped at one point, lens tilted back toward the fire ring, catching the weak spill of flame in the dark scrub beyond. Their footsteps faded into the distance. Then the night went quiet. For a long moment there was nothing but wind and the hiss of a dying fire. I almost believed the rest would be empty, an abandoned recording left behind. Then something slid into frame, low to the ground, moving in short, deliberate bursts, stopping at the edge of firelight like it understood exactly where safety ended. Its body was slick and dark. Its limbs were too long, bent, distorted. It lifted its head, and the silhouette of horns cut through the dim glow. It paused, not startled but perhaps aware, as if it knew the camera was watching, and wanted the camera to know it was being watched back. It crept closer until the lens filled with its face. Huge reflective eyes, pale light catching in them like wet glass, that sharp head tilt. And then its mouth opened slowly. Not a snarl, not a roar, but something that looked too much like a smile. Needle teeth packed tight, layered, made for holding. The clicking chatter rose soft and intimate, like it was speaking directly into the microphone. Then the image went dark as something covered the lens. Not a cut, not a glitch, a deliberate closing. And when the screen turned black, the last thing you heard was that sound, teeth talking in the dark, before it shut the world off. I sat there staring at the blank screen, the office too bright, the air too dry, the hum of fluorescent lights suddenly loud enough to feel like pressure. On the monitor, the last frozen frame was just darkness. No image, no movement, nothing to prove what my ears had heard. But I could still hear it anyway, faint and intimate, like teeth clicking behind a smile. I shut the laptop and leaned back, palms flat on the desk, trying to steady my breathing like that would steady anything else. The official report I filed that day was clean. Shoreline evidence, abandoned camp, signs of forced entry at the lighthouse. 2 Coast Guard personnel injured, 1 near-fatal man overboard incident, both recovered, high-risk conditions, no survivors located, recommended restrictions. I used the right words, the kind of words that fit in boxes and make people nod as if the world is still orderly. The parts that didn't fit, horns and lightning, shadows on stone, hands pulling from black water, I left out. Not because I didn't believe them, because I knew what would happen if I put them in writing. Someone would read them once, frown, and bury the page the way Daniel's report had been buried. But I didn't let it die in paperwork. I pushed hard for a sealed internal memorandum, restricted access, limited distribution, recommending permanent closure of Devil's Island and a formal do not land advisory added to local navigation warnings. No tourism, no daredevil trips, no exceptions. I wanted signage posted on the nearest accessible coast. I wanted coordinates flagged. I wanted it treated like a live hazard, not a creepy legend. A place that kills people doesn't get to be a rumor just because it's inconvenient. The island was marked restricted. The lighthouse was listed as unsafe, and for a while, it felt like the world had listened. Hawkins survived. Barely. He didn't talk much after medical cleared him. When he did, it was in fragments, salt water in his lungs, a pressure like hands around his ankles, the clicking sang sound right under his ear before the surface broke. He wouldn't look at the ocean after that. Not the way he used to. I couldn't blame him. I'd started waking up at night with the taste of iron in my mouth, listening to the house settle and thinking of stone walls and hands that didn't need doors. Time moved. The paperwork closed. The island sat out there, dark on the horizon, and months turned into a year, then 2. And then on a quiet afternoon that felt too ordinary, Daniel Mercer walked into my station. He looked better than he had in the hospital photographs, but not by much. He was thinner, older around the eyes, the kind of man who carried his fear the way some people carry a limp, something you learn to live with, something that never fully heals. He didn't ask permission to sit. He just came into my office, shut the door behind him, and set a folded printout on my desk with a careful, steady hand. I asked what the paper was, even though my stomach already knew. Daniel didn't sit down. He stayed standing, like he didn't trust chairs, like he didn't trust being relaxed in any room with corners. I unfolded the paper and listened as he told me how he had found it online, only online for a few days before it was taken down. It was a news article about a missing persons case. 3 college friends, 2 young men and a young woman. Urban explorers, the kind who chase abandoned places for footage and adrenaline. They'd been gone a week before anyone reported it because they'd told everyone they were going off-grid to film something big. The location line punched me straight in the chest. Devil's Island Lighthouse. Daniel watched my face while I read. When I looked up, his eyes didn't hold surprise. I stared at the paper until the words blurred. In the back of my mind, I heard the video again, the slow crawl toward the lens, the head tilt, the needle teeth, the smile. I thought of the lighthouse walls lit by lightning with shadows climbing them. I thought of Hawkins's bloody hands on the rail. I thought of how easy it is for people to forget a warning when it's been quiet for long enough. Daniel leaned forward just slightly, lowering his voice as if the building itself might be listening. They weren't kids with a dare this time, he said. They went looking for it. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to, because I knew in my gut they had found more than they went searching for. I folded the paper back up and held it in my hand, then offered it back to Daniel. He shook his head and told me to keep it. Outside my office, the station sounded normal. Phones, footsteps, a muted laugh from the hallway. Inside, the air felt colder. I asked what he wanted me to do. They had gone missing weeks ago. Daniel's answer was simple, and it landed heavy in the quiet between us. I want you to believe me, he said. His hand drifted to the paper on my desk, then to the window beyond my shoulder, like you could see the ocean from here if you stared long enough, like you could see the island if you stared hard enough. But Devil's Island doesn't forget, he said in a low voice. As long as that lighthouse is standing, they'll be there, waiting. I didn't argue. I didn't need to ask how he could be so sure. I'd seen the claw marks in stone. I'd heard the teeth in the dark. I lost one man to the things on that island, and I'd watched another nearly get pulled under by something that didn't care whether I believed in it or not. I looked at Daniel, and he looked back at me, and there was no comfort in either of our faces, only that shared understanding that the story wasn't ending. It never would. Daniel tapped the paper once, gentle but final. "People will keep going," he said. "Dares, videos, proof." I swallowed, feeling the old cold settle behind my ribs as he continued. "And when the night and the storms come, so will the demons, and they are hungry." He looked at me for a moment and then turned and walked away. I looked down at the paper he left on my desk. For a moment my hand shook as I picked up the phone. Then I forced my voice steady and said, "This is Lieutenant Reed. I need a search and rescue call-out." I stared at the black letters on the page as I spoke, feeling that familiar dread tighten in my chest. 3 missing. Devil's Island Lighthouse. Stories like these leave a weight behind long after the details start to blur. Some people will say it was a bad storm, bad luck, and fear feeding on itself in the dark. Others will say there are places in this world that don't belong to us anymore. Places where something has been waiting in silence for a very long time, and where the only real mistake is thinking the warning signs were meant for someone else. And if we weren't there, if we didn't hear the claws on stone and the teeth clicking in the dark ourselves, who are we to decide what was real and what wasn't? Thank you for joining us tonight on Whispers After Dark. If you want the next chapter of this Devil's Island series, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss part 3 when it drops. You'll find more stories waiting in our playlists. Creature encounters, disappearances, cursed places, and slow burn horror built for late nights. For now, we'll let the storm carry on. Let the dark settle in. And if you ever find yourself staring out at a stretch of water that feels too quiet, remember that some lighthouses aren't there to guide you home. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and beware of the whispers after dark.